Okay. How many of you are multiple personalities? Great, my God. I'll change the question. I'll use Gene Houston's phrasing. How many of you are polyphrenic? How many polyphrenics do we have here? Okay, so I don't mean how many of you have multiple personality disorders, but how many of you have never had this experience? You're in an intimate relationship, and you get into conflict, and you find yourself doing and saying things that you know are taking it down the drain, and you can't stop that person. Anybody never have that experience? And the next day you say, who was that? And your partner's saying, who was that? That's not who I married. And that's a really good question. Who was that? Was that just your temper? Or was that just a bundle of anger? Or if when you were hijacked, in my language, by that part of you, did you not transform into a different person, essentially, with a whole different way of seeing the world? Now everything is black and white. Right, I'm right, she's wrong. Whole different way of seeing your partner, who seconds earlier was reasonably attractive and now suddenly looks fairly ugly and menacing. Whole different physiology. So for me, that's sort of an example of what I'm calling a part. And my take is, if you were to focus on that in your body and ask a few questions from a place of curiosity, you would learn that indeed it isn't just a bundle of anger, that in fact, that part of you has fear, has pain, has a lot of things it wants you to know that you haven't listened to, is tired of being in this role of being your protector all the time. So that's what I'm calling a part. Now, I didn't think about people this way at all until about 25 years ago. And as Rich said, I'm trained as a family therapist. In those days, in the early 80s, I was set to prove the impact of family therapy and that you didn't need to think about internal process to help people heal. I made the mistake of doing an outcome study in those days, actually with a colleague who's presenting here, Mary Jo Barrett. We gathered together 30 bulimic clients and their families, started to reorganize the families just the way the book said to do it, and my clients, for some reason, didn't cooperate. And they continued to binge and purge, and it was out of frustration that I began to ask them about what was happening inside of them, and they began to teach me this model. So what I'm telling you, I learned from my clients, and they began to talk this language of parts. They would say, when something bad happened in the outside world, maybe my father looked at me wrong or I failed on a test, this critic would start to barrage me and attack me inside and call me all sorts of horrible names. And that would bring up another part that would make me feel worthless totally, and young and empty and alone and desperate. And that state was so terrifying that this binge would come in to rescue me from that and turn me into an unfeeling eating machine. But the act of the binge would in turn trigger the critic, who would attack me for having done that, which in turn would bring forth this desperate, worthless, empty, needy state, which was so distressing, and then the binge would have to come in again, and I would do that all day long. And to me, as a family therapist, this sounded familiar. It sounded like those circular sequences of interactions that I was studying in families. And as Rich said, I began to co-create experiments with my clients to try to intervene in those sequences. And I would say, why don't you go home? This time when the critic attacks you, don't just passively sit there, stand up for yourself. And she would come back and say, that just made it much worse. And in fact, a number of our little experiments really did backfire, and that's why I've become a kind of crusader for doing this in a safe way, because I did hurt some clients along the way. And part of the reason that I hurt them was I made the mistake that many psychotherapies make, which is to judge these parts by the way they seem. The critics were internal voices from the outside of critical parents, perhaps. The bingers were just impulses that were out of control. And I would encourage my clients to do battle. And I would sometimes as I learned a kind of Gestalt open chair technique, do battle with these parts too. And it wasn't until my first survivor of sex abuse, which again was in the early 80s, who also was a cutter. She would self-mutilate. And this was driving me crazy. The fact that someone would be doing this on my watch and would have to come in and show me the open wounds every week. And one session, I decided the part is not leaving my office until it agreed to not do this anymore. And 2.5 hours later, I think it was just totally worn down by the tag team barraging of me and my client. It agreed to not do it, and of course, the next week I opened the door, and now she's got a big gash down the middle of her face. And I kind of collapsed at that point when I saw that, and I said, I give up. You win. This is a dangerous game, and I can't beat you. And the part softened immediately and said, you know, I don't really want to beat you. And that made me shift. I shifted out of this kind of power, coercive place to a point of curiosity and just said, well, then why do you do it? And the part proceeded to tell she and I the story of how when she was being abused, how necessary it was to get her out of her body, and that was a way to do that. And also a way to sit on the rage that if it came out and took over would get her hurt more. And again, I shifted out of curiosity to compassion and appreciation for how hard that part had worked to keep her safe all those years. And in return, the part told me more about how it still had to do this now, because if it didn't, the rage still would come out, and there were all these other parts of her that were still locked in the past, stuck during those abuse times, and she had to keep her out of her body for fear of those parts, of experiencing those kinds of parts. And my basic contention to you is that all of these parts have a story like that. Longfellow has a quote that I will butcher because I never quite get it right, that goes something like, if you knew the secret history of your worst enemy, it would be enough to dissolve all hostility or disarm all hostility. And I believe that goes for both external enemies and internal enemies, that these parts of us that we've been battling in different ways are really just trying to help.